there is more that Taiwan can do, and I completely understand the plight and the pressure and so on, but I think the Congress and the State Department need to hear from President Tsai herself, in a major U.S. newspaper, exactly what she faces in terms of the coercion campaign. Because right now she's pushing on an open door because it's such a hot topic in the United States, and so to really get the message over the heads of official channels. Taiwan, like any small democracy, will never win if it keeps things only in bureaucratic channels. It's nothing against bureaucratic channels. It's just that bureaucracies are set up to follow standard protocols and do certain things, and that's where you also saw the removal of the Taiwan flag from State Department websites. They just automatically do things. Taiwan, there's no small democracy in the world that gains from just keeping things in bureaucratic channels. They have to make their case right to the American people, who, at the end of the day, side with freedom, loving countries and liberty, loving countries. It's just here in Washington where we lose all common sense, and so, and buy some of these arguments about sovereignty. But you go 20 miles out and ask somebody, who would you rather support, free and democratic Taiwan or a communist, Leninist China, and I think you get your answer pretty clearly. So Taiwan has to make its case much better and much more creatively in this social media environment and in this media environment in general, and that's something that it really can do. And so it's really up to the United States. It's really becoming a little bit binary. How much are you going to support your free allies and partners? In the face of this revisionism, but Taiwan has its role as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I think throughout all of this, I just continuously find it to be a little absurd that China claims that these air routes are really there for aviation safety, but they don't actually talk to anyone. They didn't tell anyone about it. Like, they have no mechanism to even communicate with Taiwan and any other aircraft. Don't really think that's how aviation safety functions. But I want to open the panel to questions from the audience, but while I give you guys some time to think of your questions, we do have 2 mics up in the front. You can just press the button to turn them on. But I'm going to just open up kind of a very broad one to the panel really quickly before I give you guys an opportunity. I want to talk a little bit about policy recommendations. What can, if this is, as Mark said, if this is, you have to watch closely on whether or not China is making greater moves to unilaterally claim that the Taiwan Strait is PRC waters. What can the U.S. do to sort of reinforce international waters, to reinforce our relationship with Taiwan and our influence and our interest in the Asia-Pacific region at large? Mark, do you want to take it?
Let me start by addressing a couple small issues that I missed. I think Ian raised the Shanghai Flight Information Region. This is relevant because there was reporting at 2008, again in the context of when this issue at least was publicly raised, or at least the year after, about the possibility of redefining the Taipei Flight Information Region as, for example, the ninth of, let's say, 11 or 12 Chinese PRC-controlled flight identification regions. This would be significant. In other words, if you suddenly just say that there's no longer a type, or at least declaring a Taipei Flight Information Region as a PRC-controlled flight information, this would be really problematic. The second thing I failed to mention before is that the changes to the M503 air route and then the addition of the spurs announced on 4th January this year. The next day, there was an aircraft carrier transit by a PRC, a PLA aircraft carrier transit. I don't think this was coincidental. I don't think it's coincidental. So in terms of, and the last quick point is that the air activity, whether it's the flights around Taipei, or the modification to M503 without any prior consultation, and then the spurs takes place in a broader context. There are other things going on. Say, for example, a coercion against air aviation companies, Delta, forcing them to change some of their language and other companies that were going on. So none of this stuff happens in a vacuum. The shift, incentives provide, for the taking away of diplomatic, diplomatic allies. All these things are pretty part of a pattern of coercion. And one of the first things I'd recommend is simply, take another look at the Taiwan Relations Act in terms of it's in the U.S. interest to forget the exact language, but it's to respond to use of force and other forms of coercion. And so simply because of U.S. domestic law, it's something I think that warrants a lot more attention than it's getting in terms of U.S. interest. But looking at this from a positive perspective, another recommendation, and this comes more to civil society, those of us who are kind of geeks in terms of looking at the PLA in detail, it should open up some interesting questions. Just to dig, if they're being so prominent and so visible in terms of their military presence, what exactly, where are these flights coming from, particularly on the B6s and the Y8s? But based on just even a limited thing, it's not hard to find this out, especially if there are pictures taken of these flights of the aircraft. There are probably 2 bomber divisions, one from the Eastern Theater Command, one from the Southern Theater Command, and then what appear to be 2 special aircraft mission divisions. You can go down to the exact regiment. You can actually see these things on Google Earth. You can see the Y8s and the bombers. Extreme detail on where they're coming from. Another detailed question. If they're increasing their flight activity, and also we have these new air routes, what exactly is the, who's controlling these flights? We're talking about the individual on the ground, on the radio. Detail. Probably the controller, these aircraft are under control. And there's going to be some PLA Air Force individuals, probably from maybe sitting in Fuzhou, maybe Zhangzhou near Xiamen, maybe in Shanghai. Detail exactly how this process works in detail. A detailed look at their air surveillance structure. CSIS has a great program called the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. Be interesting. How about a transparency initiative on PLA air posture to include air surveillance? Natural question. How exactly do they control their airspace? Another question that should be asked on the PLA side is, I think you alluded to, was it really necessary to establish this air route in 503? Why did they do it? Well, the reason that authorities in Beijing use is, as Rachel mentioned, has to do with safety of flight and congestion, flight delays, and congestion on this one air route that connects, for example, Shanghai and the Yangtze River Delta, as well as Hong Kong. Well, why do they have to do it over the Taiwan Strait? It seems kind of provocative, unnecessarily political, just by itself. Why wouldn't they do a parallel route over Southeast China itself? Maybe you can. There's different options, but this is a bit of a rhetorical question because bear in mind, as mentioned before, airspace controlled PLA. There's a reason why the PLA is really in charge when it comes to the staffing that goes into all airspace management with the State Air Traffic Control Commission and what is now the Central Military Commission Joint Staff Department Air Traffic Control Bureau, actually Operations Bureau specifically runs this. The reason for the flight delays and the problems that is a legitimate complaint by some of their airlines flying from Shanghai to Guangzhou or Hong Kong. But is the real reason because of congestion on the air route, or is the real reason because the PLA, let's say for example, exercises. Without any announcement, they will shut off. They'll just say, stop flights between these times. And you'll have passengers sitting in Pudong Airport or maybe Hongqiao or something. They'll be sitting and not wondering what's going on. How much of this really is attributed to PLA in terms of it's their fault? And why don't they have another air route that goes to that area? I would argue again, and bear in mind that this is Southeast Asia, or Southeast part of China. There's a lot of military stuff there, a lot of training exercises. There's, I forgot the name of that particular Army training area. Maybe it's just because they don't want to use that. And that's one other reason. So this opens up the interesting questions, is why was it? I just instinctively would question the rationale for this whole thing from the very beginning. Other more specific recommendations, I would say Number one, the United States, I think it's critical, trying to get ahead of the game here, trying to get ahead of the ball. We normally, in terms of our policy, are reactive. But in my view, the possibility of eventually moving toward a complete outright PRC claim over the water space within the Taiwan Strait, if not airspace over the Taiwan Strait and over Taiwan, is something that bears further, I think bears serious watch. And if you look at the 9-dash line, for example, if you look at the 9-dash line about where exactly, if there's room, if they are drawn with precision, notice that uppermost there 9-dash line about where it goes, right up at the top part of Taiwan itself. This requires some clarification. I would argue that it doesn't hurt, at a minimum. When is the last time there's been a U.S. State Department, for example, or DOD, or White House, a declaration to ensure that the Taiwan Strait is international waters? As far as I know, the last time there's been a public statement, I may be wrong, and I'm quite willing to be corrected wrong, probably would have been in 2007, 2008, when there was reporting that came out, who was the PACOM commander at the time that came out, there was a transit of a U.S. Aircraft carrier, I believe, that was denied out of Hong Kong, huh? I think it was somebody, and there was, I think, maybe a demarche or something like that from Beijing, or a question that was asked, and the PACOM commander, I think quite rightly, said, we don't have to ask anybody's permission. These are international waters. I'm not aware of any clear statement made since that point, or at least publicly, if there's been any U.S. Navy, there may have been one U.S. Air Force flight, but any U.S. Navy transit through the Taiwan Strait just to assert freedom of navigation. To me, this is important to make sure that you don't lose that. And to me, this is important. Number two, just in case, review FAA, Federal Aviation Administration cooperation with China. If this does turn into a problem, you need to look at this, what we're doing, what FAA, bear in mind how much Beijing relies upon FAA for airworthiness certifications of their aircraft. It's critical. That's leverage. You need to take a very close look at this. Another one, we need to have more active support within the ICAO forum, and as well as looking very carefully at the specific forum or some kind of working group established for this era, the M503 era. It may have a linkage with Southeast Asia. The United States needs to have a seat at the table in discussing this era, particularly if it goes into international waters. I think we may have taken ourselves out of this. Other more provocative, what maybe if you more provocative, other opportunities. Ever thought of maybe if there are flights on there, there's good stuff to watch. How about looking at things like a common air picture between the U.S. and Taiwan and others in the region for the good of all? Maybe consider, this is Taiwan's decision, there may be radars for radars, and without going too technical, but looking at a more diverse set of radars in different parts of the frequency spectrum, all the way from HF, like a relocatable over the horizon radar, smaller in nature, not big, but that has value, not just military, but in general, airspace awareness in general. Looking at things like an X-band radar. Provocative, because automatically you think X-band radar, you think THAAD radar, but is there some benefit to a radar that has similar characteristics to something like THAAD? Not just the whole missile defense system, but like a THAAD-like radar. Taiwan already has a very good radar, UHF radar, but could there be some additional assets there to be able to ensure awareness in that area? And then, as Dan mentioned, this is, again, is Taiwan's decision, but if and when Taiwan, through their own democratic and bureaucratic process, have decided to submit a letter of request for additional advanced fighters, whether that be F-16Bs or some kind of an F-35, it's really up to Taiwan. I think there should be positive consideration if and when that request is submitted.
I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience. If there's anything. No, I will keep asking questions. Oh, please.
My name is Yang. Thanks for your presentation, but I would like to ask a little bit different angle. I think for Taiwan, or maybe the world, to think of now the situation, what the Taiwanese people want to make a decision, or China want to make a decision. So I want to know exactly what they should decide, some kind of decision, whether this air power threat would increase the USA defense and military spending. Second is the war is changing, and United States, Trump wants to drain the swamp, and Xi Jinping say they want to fight against the corruption. So exactly which direction Taiwanese will benefit in terms of this moral or cultural value. Whether in a sense, whether Xi Jinping, they have a more discipline in terms of Confucius religion or philosophy, that kind of training, whether the Taiwanese now or toward the same direction, because they just sort of fooling around. I'm really concerned whether Taiwanese now moral value will be in negative position or directions. So could you explain these things? Because I do think democracy is really depending on feeling or conscience and justice, that kind of moral value judgment. Because otherwise, democracy is fake. It's not really democracy. And I don't want USA, they can concept is you have to follow the USA. You can have to go different directions in terms of moral value. Thank you.
And the question I also want to pose to the panel is the issue of humanitarian and disaster relief in the Taiwan Strait. As Ian mentioned, this congests the air routes. It's very difficult to traverse the seas in the Taiwan Strait. If there is an accident, how can the U.S. and Taiwan work more closely together on this issue? And GCI had an event on this today. So.
Well, just briefly addressing that question, I think you're talking about the center of gravity to the whole problem, and that is the nature of Xi Jinping's leadership of the PRC over the past 5 years and counting now. I think the false narrative is that the trouble started 2 years ago when Taiwan was elected president of Taiwan. That's the false narrative. The reality is the trouble really started 5 years ago when Xi Jinping replaced Hu Jintao as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and as the chairman of the Central Military Commission in Beijing. That's when we saw a significant ramp up in coercive behavior from China, not just towards Taiwan, but towards all of its neighbors. We've seen it against South Korea, against Japan, against India, against Vietnam and the Philippines and the South China Sea, against the United States, in outer space and cyberspace, across the board. There's been this ramp up of coercive behavior coming from China as the direct result of Xi Jinping's foreign policy preferences. His own worldview, as Dan pointed out, his view was that Hu Jintao was too soft. He was too much of a dove. Even though after the 2008 Olympics, most of the world looked at Hu Jintao and thought, this guy's really becoming way more authoritarian than we anticipated him becoming. In Xi Jinping's view, he was a failure because he was too soft. And so we've seen this steady ramp up of coercive behavior. And I agree with you. As a democracy, or as a community of democracies that do value things like rule of law and human rights and self-determination, it behooves us to respond to coercion very directly, not to hide from it. Because Chinese coercion thrives in an environment where we stand silent as a weaker democracy gets bullied. And the United States, the strongest country in the planet, in human history, stands by and says nothing, and does nothing. And so to get to Rachel's question about policy options, and building off of what Mark said in terms of what we could do immediately, to show that the United States finds this type of coercive behavior, this type of intimidation unacceptable, there's, in addition to what Mark said there, or building off of that, obviously arms sales, right, is expressing a willingness from the United States, if it was a desire from Taipei to sell Taiwan a new fighter aircraft, and to link it directly to Taiwan's darkening air defense picture as a result of Chinese behavior. The second is we could start to do high-level visits in terms of general officers going to Taiwan from the 7th Fleet, from PACOM, from the Pentagon, and to link that directly to the need for that is because of Chinese behavior and Chinese actions. We could have things like ship visits. This has been something that I know there's been a lot of excitement in that regard up here on Capitol Hill. And I think that's something to continue looking at because it does merit careful consideration. We could see something at a high level, something that would really send a strong message, is if President Trump called President Tsai again. Well, before she called him. If he were to pick up the phone and call her, and they could talk about these issues, not just M503, not just the bomber circling the island, but the entire scope, the entire spectrum of Chinese coercion against Taiwan. Just to simply state, and you could do this in 2 minutes, for the President of the United States to say to a fellow democratically elected leader, we support your democracy, and we support what you're doing, and we stand by the Taiwan Relations Act and President Reagan's 6 assurances to Taiwan. So there's a whole range of different options that the United States has at its disposal. And up here on Capitol Hill, obviously the Taiwan Travel Act is now soon to be voted on in the Senate and then to go to the President's desk. These type of things, if properly calibrated and discussed and made clear the driving force behind it, why this is necessary, and to link it directly to Chinese behavior, this could have a very powerful impact because, again, coercion thrives in an environment where the United States stays silent. If we don't stay silent, if we push back, if we react, if we speak up for our friends and our allies, then all of a sudden Xi Jinping's policies start to look very different. And I think they would start to look very different to him. And he might start to realize how destabilizing his behavior is and how much of a failure it's become. But again, as Dan said, it all hinges on what the United States does.
Got a couple of policy options. Unless there was another question.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't need a mic. Nicholas Romero, I'm with the Foreign Policy Initiative Future Leaders Program. My question is, we've heard increased talk about a bloody nose scenario in the Korean Peninsula. And I was just wondering if the United States were to become heavily involved in Korea, how might that affect the Taiwan relationship with China, or how might China take advantage of a scenario like that vis-a-vis Taiwan?
Bloody, I have a piece coming out tomorrow on foreign policy. Bloody nose is the textbook definition of fake news. It's one of those things that a UK piece that I tracked back in December quoted some former security officials and Lindsey Graham that there's this bloody nose strategy. You ask anyone who has any policy-making authority, and they've never heard of it until it was reported in the Wall Street Journal. It's just, does the U.S. plan for all sorts of contingencies, as Chairman Dunford said? Absolutely. But it's not the policy of the United States. That said, it's a lie that's become, I guess Churchill said, the lie goes around the world before the truth can put its pants on, and that's what happened here. The lie has become the truth, and it's just not true. But yes, so the connection she makes a geopolitical connection, as Mao did, between Korea and Taiwan. And one point of leverage the United States has with respect to Xi and Korea is that he doesn't. One of the reasons we have to keep threatening war, despite all the hysterics back home, is because we have to make, he doesn't want a war on Korea, he's afraid he'll lose Taiwan. The logic of not planning for military options on Korea makes no sense to me. Yeah.
Is there another question?
Well, Rachel, I just very quickly, I don't need a mic either, but I wondered, since Ian flagged the issue of, well, you all did, flagged the issue of a fighter sale to Taiwan, what other capabilities should the US government be considering and linking to Chinese behavior?
Let me quickly, I just have a few policy options. Obviously, some of what Mark mentioned that I don't understand, but I'm sure is excellent on the radar side. Look, I've always advocated that Taiwan can be a center for U.S. And regional cooperation on everything from cyber information campaigns or counter campaigns to, I mean, if you really want China to back off, start talking about designating Taiwan, giving them some real cyber and information capabilities and designating them as a center for excellence. It's not hardware, but obviously, every other piece of hardware. I mean, Taiwan's at the center of, Taiwan's at the front lines of these information and cyber campaigns, and so there's a lot of experimentation the United States can do, but just the political act of designating it as a center for excellence, I think would back China off. The other policy options, I mean, there are so many. I mean, international waters, I mean, that we just automatically do front ops to ensure that, that international waters are international waters. The Congress authorized port visits. If you want to, there's nothing in the one China policy or the, which to me is still baffling that we have one, given that everyone who wrote it is dead now. Anyway, we have it. There's nothing to prohibit port visits that would also demonstrate that China is not going to self-define what we do as well as what international waters are. And on and on it goes. I mean, air convoys, if there's no air safety, massive FAA conference in Taiwan on air safety. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But we just need a certain level of creativity from the State Department on how to counter these things, and not going backwards by removing Taiwan's flag from websites. Let's move in the wrong direction. I don't take it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll add. I mean, generally, I think different kinds of anti-air and anti-surface warfare capabilities would be among the things we're looking at in terms of specific military capabilities. But I mean, to the broader point Dan raised earlier about kind of pushing back against influence operations. I mean, that's, although it's the media coverage of it really centered a lot on Australia recently. I mean, for obvious reasons. I mean, it's a concern for Australia, for Taiwan, for the United States, for a number of countries in Europe. Increasingly, I think for Singapore. I mean, it's a concern for a lot of different allies and partners of the U.S. and countries that have partnerships of one sort or another with Taiwan. So, trying to think about how we might work together to kind of evaluate and understand how China's strategy works, how they implement the strategy, what are the kind of tactics that they're using, and whether that's something that any one country in particular takes the lead on, or it's something where maybe more countries work together and think about how to develop some strategies for kind of mitigating the effects of those information operations, pushing back, deciding maybe what things if exposed publicly might stop working, or there could be a whole bunch of different approaches there that are not they're not about arms sales, or not about other things that are typically the ones that people kind of get excited about and that generate a lot of attention, but might have potentially some important effects that we can explore.
One, Rupert, direct, I would say that we're not exactly sure what letters of request are actually on the table, but the most obvious one, in my opinion, is simply going through and approving whatever export or marketing licenses have been submitted for assistance, providing assistance to Taiwan's indigenous submarine program. That is just so, that's one of the most obvious things. As far as I know, they've been frozen. And this should be a no-brainer on licensing with, bear in mind, making sure to keep export control considerations, but this, I don't know why this is so hard, and has been so hard for export licenses. Bearing in mind U.S. technology, export controls, but this is the first, in my view, the most obvious thing that we can do today.
Let me just add. It was a question I think earlier on about freedom and which way Taiwan should go. one way to get the rest of the free world on Taiwan's side is you're up